Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, distinguished professor at Rutgers Law School and author of the book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. You can follow me on social media at Sahar Aziz Law and learn more about my work at saharazizlaw.com. I also serve as the executive director of the Rutgers Law School Center for Security, Race and Rights, known as CSRR. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on law and policy that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To learn more about CSRR's work, visit us on our website, csr.rutgers.edu, and follow us on social media at Rutgers CSRR and RUCSRR. And if you find the Race and Rights podcast informative, please consider making a donation by going to csrr.rutgers.edu and pressing the donate button. And please give generously. In this episode, I speak with Josh Paul about the law, politics, and policies surrounding the United States' decades-long military aid to Israel, and specifically how such aid makes the U.S. complicit in Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza since October 2023. A genocide that the majority of international legal scholars and Holocaust studies experts have concluded is in fact a genocide. Josh Paul resigned from the State Department due to his disagreement with the Biden administration's decision to rush lethal military assistance to Israel in the context of its war on Gaza. He had previously spent over 11 years working as a director in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, which is responsible for U.S. defense diplomacy, security assistance, and arms transfers. He previously worked on security sector reform in both Iraq and the West Bank, with additional roles in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, U.S. Army Staff, and as a military legislative assistant for a member of the U.S. House Armed Services Committee. Josh Paul currently serves as the co-founder of A New Policy, an organization dedicated to transforming American foreign policy toward Israel-Palestine to reflect American values and foundational principles of liberty, equality, democracy, and human rights. Now, at the time of our conversation in May of 2025, Israel's bombings and targeted assassinations in Gaza of doctors, journalists, and professors had killed over 65,000 Palestinians, including more than 18,000 children, and injured more than 150,000 Palestinians. Israel's military has destroyed every university in Gaza. It has fully destroyed over 70% of all hospitals in Gaza and partially destroyed the remaining 30%, resulting in an unknown number of Palestinians dying from otherwise treatable diseases and injuries. And for 11 weeks in the spring of 2025, Israel banned the entry of all humanitarian aid and food into Gaza as part of an intentional mass starvation campaign that has caused unprecedented severe malnutrition for tens of thousands of Palestinian children and women and men. The devastation that Israel has wreaked upon the 2.3 million Palestinian civilians trapped in Gaza as collective punishment for Hamas's militant attacks and war crimes on October 7, 2023, is so extensive that we can have an entire podcast series on the topic. Today, however, we will be focusing on how the United States of America has directly aided and abetted this genocidal campaign by Israel against Palestinians through $20 billion in military aid since October 2023, all funded by American taxpayer dollars. Let's hear what our guest has to say about a topic that has become a permanent stain on U.S. foreign policy and undermined the rule of law internationally. Welcome, Josh Paul, to the Race and Rights podcast. It's a pleasure to have you as our guest today, and we're deeply grateful for your generosity of expertise that you'll be sharing with our listeners on a topic that's quite complex: military arms exports and security assistance by the United States to foreign countries. Now, today we're going to be focusing on Israel primarily because of the horrific genocide that's occurring in Gaza and that has been occurring for over 18 months. And for our listeners who may not agree that it's a genocide, each week and each month that passes, more and more international legal scholars, international organizations, and Holocaust and genocide studies experts are in fact agreeing and concluding that what Israel is doing is a genocide. And it has had horrific consequences for the lives and safety of Palestinians, the 2 million that are trapped in Gaza. So that genocide could not occur without U.S. military aid. And that's why the subject is important to all Americans, because they're funding it with their money. So can you start out our conversation by explaining the laws that govern U.S. arms exports and security assistance and what the difference is between these two phrases?
Yeah, thanks, Sahar. And it's a real pleasure to join you. And I say that as a listener these days to the podcast of the Center for Security, Race and Rights. So really glad to join you. First of all, as you said in opening, there is a significant American role in Israel's military operations in essentially everything Israel does with the Israeli Defense Forces and with its own internal security forces. And to understand that, it's useful to start by thinking about how those relationships work, particularly when it comes to the materiel, by which I mean the actual weapons that the US provides that Israel has been using with such devastating effect in Gaza and indeed elsewhere in the region. So there are two main mechanisms through which the US provides arms to countries overseas, to partners around the world. Those are, first of all, through government transfers, which is what we call the foreign military sales process. And secondly, through the licensing of exports from private US companies through what we call the direct commercial sales process. Both of those go through the Bureau of Political Military Affairs in the State Department. And that's because at the end of the day, arms transfers are seen in the US government essentially as a tool of foreign policy. They are there not only to provide partners and allies with military capabilities, but also to provide the United States with diplomatic leverage, with influence over its partners and allies through those dependencies on our defense articles and services. So again, for the most part, it's government-to-government sales. And just to give you a sense of scale, in an average year, that's about $55 billion worth of agreements. And then it's direct exports from US companies overseas, US arms manufacturers, to be clear, overseas. And in a typical year, that is closer to $150 billion a year. So all told, it tends to be in the range of $180 to $200 billion a year across the scope of what we're talking about through those two main mechanisms.
Thank you for that summary that I know is quite abbreviated compared to the complexity of the process. But let me ask you kind of a follow-up question, because I'm sure that our listeners are not as familiar and as conversant as you are with the intricacies of the law and policy governing U.S. arms exports and security assistance. So can you explain the mechanisms by which the U.S. exports arms? I understand there is foreign military financing, which is called FMF. There's foreign military sales, which is called FMS, and other mechanisms by which the U.S. exports arms abroad to foreign countries in general, whether it's Israel or otherwise.
Yeah, so here, if you're ready, we'll dive into the weeds a little bit, because there's an important difference that we have to tackle at the beginning that I think often gets lost in the public coverage and the public debate of these things. And that difference relates to how they are funded. So there are two main laws that we're going to be talking about today. The first is the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, as amended, which relates and covers essentially the vast majority of American foreign assistance of all types, of US taxpayer money, government money that is spent to provide assistance to countries overseas, whether that is development assistance, humanitarian assistance, or in the context we're talking about, military assistance. Then there is the Arms Export Control Act of 1976, which governs transfers themselves. So that's the mechanisms that we were just talking about, the foreign military sales system, the direct commercial sales system. And that separation between these two major statutes is also then reflected in terms of how the laws apply. And what you find, whether intentionally or unintentionally, is that most of the laws that relate to, for example, human rights are in the Foreign Assistance Act. They're in that 1961 bill signed by President Kennedy that relates to how our money is spent. And so in the context of arms transfers, much of the time, the US will provide grant funding to other countries to help them buy US weapons in order to build their military capability, etc. And so that grant funding, the most common source of it is an account called the Foreign Military Financing Account, or FMF. So don't confuse that with FMS, with foreign military sales. This is foreign military financing. But for that or other sources of US money, that's where the Foreign Assistance Act mostly applies. And so there are a number of laws within and sections within the Foreign Assistance Act. Your listenership will probably be most familiar with the Leahy Law, which was codified into the Foreign Assistance Act in the 1990s as section, as 22 USC 2738D. And the Leahy Law is the one that says that you cannot provide assistance, meaning in this context, at least as it's interpreted, grant assistance, to a unit of a foreign security force if there is credible information that unit has committed a gross violation of human rights. Happy to come back and crack out all of what that means, but that's one example. Another section that is relevant, I think, in this conversation is Section 620I of the Foreign Assistance Act, which says that we cannot provide any assistance to the government of a country that is prohibiting or otherwise restricting, directly or indirectly, the transport or delivery of US humanitarian assistance. So again, that's not an outright prohibition on arms transfers. It is a prohibition on the funding of those transfers. Where it gets a little, or where there is a clear overlap, I would say, in the Foreign Assistance Act, just to give one final example from that act, is Section 502B. This is a law that says that the US government cannot provide security assistance to any country that is engaged in a consistent pattern of gross violations of internationally recognized human rights. And where 502B differs from the Leahy Law is that it expressly does not only apply itself to security assistance in the sense of grant assistance, but to any military sales, including export licenses. That's the Foreign Assistance Act piece of this. On the other hand, there is the Arms Export Control Act. And here there's unfortunately a lot less when it comes specifically to questions of human rights. The Arms Export Control Act in Section 4 does lay out a list of purposes for which arms may be transferred. They include legitimate self-defense, to participate in regional or collective arrangements to counter the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And then Section 3 of the same act says that the president may prohibit the transfer of arms if it is found that those arms have previously been used for purposes not authorized. I think you or I sitting here would say that genocide, that human rights abuses, that war crimes are clearly not a purpose for which US arms are ever provided. And that's before we even get into the question of whether Israel's operations in Gaza do constitute legitimate self-defense. But, a problem with both of these sets of laws is that it is ultimately up to, in most cases, the executive branch to trigger them. There is very little ability to press it to do so from the outside.
Yes, I think that is certainly a common critique that human rights advocates have had with regard to U.S. foreign policy in general, but particularly these laws on the books like the Leahy Act, among others, that are supposed to ensure that American taxpayer dollars does not directly and even indirectly facilitate human rights violations. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about how the policymaking process on arms transfers works in practice, but let me first start with asking that you do give us a little bit more about the Leahy Act, a little bit more about its history, its background, and how it has historically applied to Israel and Arab countries. And Egypt is, well, now I believe it's the third largest recipient of military aid after Jordan being second, and then after Israel being first. It used to be where Egypt was second. And correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that Jordan...
Egypt is still second.
Is it? Okay.
In the Middle East, yeah.
So I think Jordan then is catching up. It has been receiving quite a bit over the last 10 to 15 years. So can you kind of do a comparative analysis of how the Leahy Act in particular, any other laws that are supposed to prevent that military aid from funding directly or indirectly human rights violations or international law violations by its recipients, and compare Israel, Egypt, and whatever Middle Eastern country that you're familiar with, how there has been consistency or inconsistency?
Sure. So the Leahy Act, the origins of the Leahy Act actually come out of America's operations, particularly in the 1980s in Central America, where, as you will recall, the US was commonly supporting death squads in, what the context of the Cold War, who were committing horrific acts of violence against churches, against civilians. And so Senator Leahy designed this law essentially to say that, where there is credible information that there has been a gross violation of human rights, you cannot provide that assistance to a unit that is doing that, which seems pretty fundamental. I think that's important to note as that starting point, because in that context, it was all grant assistance that the US was providing, right? At least after the Iran-Contra affair, that it was US funding that was going to these units. And I think that has been a bit of a wrinkle because there's been debate ever since then about the intent of the meaning of security assistance in the Leahy law. Does it actually mean just grant assistance, or like Section 502B in the same act, does it mean all arms transfers? Senator Leahy, I think if you asked him, would say the latter. But nevertheless, this is how the US government has interpreted it in that more narrow sense relating to grant assistance. So the way the Leahy law works across the world is that before, by and large, and we'll come back to the exception in a second, is that before the US provides any sort of grant assistance to a unit of the foreign security forces, or for that matter to an individual, whether in the form of equipment or training or money to buy equipment or training, it vets that unit, it vets that individual. It has, the State Department maintains a database that is linked both to public reporting as well as to intelligence reporting that looks at, for example, the names of all individuals in a unit. And that's important because, what you don't want to see is someone shifted from one unit to another and then they pop up again, or a unit being what they say called reflagged, being, just given a new name and presented as a new unit when it's the same rotten apples or what have you. And if there is a red flag that comes up during that vetting, the assistance does not proceed. And that is a flag that is thrown at very junior levels in the State Department. Junior analysts in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, or DRL, if they come across in the course of their vetting something that suggests that an individual is credibly alleged to be involved in gross violations of human rights, they simply say, we've got a red flag and that training doesn't go forward, or that assistance doesn't go forward. So that is the way it has worked for most of the Leahy law's existence across the world. What is interesting to note is even under that system, there had never been an instance in which training or assistance had been denied to a unit of the Israeli security forces because of any human rights considerations. And that does separate out Israel from the rest of the world. And it does call into question, I think, from the start, the politicization of the Leahy process. Even when you think about that word credible, what does it mean to say that there is credible evidence? And the State Department has actually defined this. You can look it up in the Leahy Vetting Handbook, which is available publicly on the State Department's website. And credible evidence doesn't mean that the US itself has to hold that evidence. Credible sources of evidence include international non-governmental organizations, include credible media reports. And when it comes, of course, to Israel's security forces, there are plenty of reports from international NGOs and from media that demonstrate a gross violation of human rights. So that's the first problem set. But in the late 2010s, so 2018, 2019, I think people were looking at this problem set in particular, and in particular in the context of Israel and Egypt, who received the bulk of US foreign military financing in a typical year. These are not typical years because we have, on top of everything else, the context of Ukraine. But by and large, that's been the case for decades. And at this point in time, Israel receives $3.3 billion a year in foreign military financing. Egypt receives $1.3 billion in foreign military financing. I'll do the math very quickly in my head, $4.6 billion. Foreign military financing, the entire account is about $6.1 billion. So just between those two countries, you've got already a large majority of US military financing. And what was realized was that, Congress said, why haven't you found any units that have been of concern in Israel? Actually, that question was asked, and more broadly in Egypt and in other countries. And looking at countries that receive a large amount of grant assistance like that, the argument was made, well, some of it is untraceable. If we are providing that much money to a country, they could be buying, thousands of small spare parts with it, which then go into a warehouse, and we have no means of tracking which units those small parts then go to. And so we can't pre-vet units because we don't know where this equipment is going to go at the time that it is bought. So Congress in 2020 amended the law, created a process for untraceable assistance, which now takes the form of what they call the Leahy Vetting Forum. And essentially what Congress requires is for countries where you are going to be providing military assistance in a way in which it could be untraceable, you have to get an assurance from that country ahead of time, a written assurance that they will not provide it to units that you identify to them as being ineligible because of credible violations, gross violations of human rights, or credible reports, of gross violations of human rights. And the way that works, in theory, is that rather than pre-vetting units, the State Department keeps a sort of global watch out for such allegations. And when they arise, it considers them. And if they are credible, then informs the country in writing, hey, under our agreement, please don't provide our assistance to the following units. Now, first of all, obviously, there are a lot of problems with this, one of them being that money is fungible. And this is a problem, of course, across the Leahy system, that just because the US isn't providing money for one unit, it doesn't mean the US can't provide money for another unit, and the other country can then shift its money to the first unit. That's the first problem. The second problem is that the system that was being set up under this structure for Israel is unlike the systems that have been set up under this structure for the other countries who receive untraceable assistance, among them, for example, Egypt, Jordan, and Ukraine. In the case of those countries, the system, given all the flaws of Leahy and all the limitations, still does work. The US does identify units of concern, does communicate those, and the countries do say, okay, we agree we will not provide that assistance. How we actually monitor the follow-through is another question, but in principle, at least, the system works. On the Israel side, and I say this having been a part of the Israel Leahy Vetting Forum in the State Department for a couple of years, it works differently. In the Israel context, first of all, it is not as it is everywhere else where a junior official can throw that red flag or name that unit and the assistance gets cut off. The decisions have to go all the way up to at least the Deputy Secretary, if not the Secretary of State. And what that does is it forces senior officials in the department to put their name on memos to the Secretary of State saying, hey, I'm recommending that you cut off this unit of Israeli security forces. And at least up until the last year and a half, no senior official in the State Department had ever been willing to do that. So no allegation, even though the Israel Leahy Vetting Forum considered many, ever really made it out of the forum, because you could never actually get a senior official to put their career on the line, to put their name on a memo. Another problem is that a part of the Israel Leahy Vetting Forum is that once there is what is assessed to be a potentially credible allegation, the next step is to actually reach out to the government of Israel and ask for their thoughts on it. And if they find this credible and if they're doing anything about it, that is another step that is unique to the Israel Leahy Vetting Forum process, as opposed to the process for all other countries. So that's just a couple of examples of how the process, unfortunately, in the Leahy law in general, just hasn't worked when it comes to the government of Israel compared to, even the process for other countries in the region.
Okay, this certainly provoked a lot of follow-up questions from my end. Two at least threshold issues is the credible evidence. As we know, and this isn't unique to Israel, but we certainly see it on full display when it comes to allegations against the Israeli military or the Israeli government violating human rights, but also when those allegations are made against Egypt or against other foreign countries. And we'll focus on the Middle East, for the purpose of our conversation here, is that they deny it. And they usually will attack the accusers, even when they're credible civil society organizations as being biased and so on and so forth. So I think a lot of us would want to know what is credible in the eyes of the U.S. State Department at the different levels that you're talking about. You mentioned news reports, you mentioned NGO reports. For example, with the case of Israel, we have Human Rights Watch, we have Amnesty International and others, including Civil Rights Society or Civil Society in Israel, that has stated Israel is an apartheid state, and that is not something that the Israeli government accepts. So what are those credible sources and where and how are those sources then debated within the State Department because they are so contentious and so politicized?
So a few things on that. I think, first of all, again, the definition of credible sources is pretty broadly written in the State Department handbook, and sources like Amnesty International and other international human rights NGOs are frequently used to inform both Leahy vetting and the State Department's annual human rights report. The latest iteration is due to come out any day. And so there has really, except in this context, very rarely, if ever, been questions raised about whether those sorts of organizations or media outlets, for example, the reporting of the New York Times, the Guardian in the UK, Le Monde in France, all of these are considered to be credible under the standard used by the State Department. And, typically, once a violation is identified, there is a process in place for the US government to work with the partner government for them to address it. For them to go through a process of investigation and of, cleaning up the unit and of holding violators accountable. And I think that's an important point to dig into here as well, because the defense that has been put forward very many times when it comes to Israel is that they are investigating it if there is an allegation. And we've heard this in the case of Shireen Abu Akleh. We've heard this in the case of many of the violations we've heard about in Gaza, that, the government of Israel is looking into it. First of all, the fact that a partner government is looking into something or is investigating something is not an obstacle to opposing Leahy sanctions, to prohibiting the delivery of arms to a unit involved. In fact, it is very frequently the case that the United States will prohibit security assistance to a unit of foreign security forces, even if there is an investigation ongoing, because an investigation does not equal a treatment. It does not equal a response that actually allows us to continue the assistance. And yet, in the context of Israel, we keep saying, well, there's an ongoing investigation. And this is something, that I think is held up many times as if, the Leahy system was a court of last resort. It is not. It is a step to measure and to control our own assistance, our own complicity, that does not need to wait for a final judgment, which is not even to address the question of whether Israel's investigations are themselves credible. And this is something that has been raised and debated at length, including within the Israel Leahy Vetting Forum and also within other State Department policy discussions, because it is very clear that there have been, claims of investigations. Sometimes, for example, there was an instance of a Palestinian man who was shot and killed at point-blank range in the head by Israeli security forces. I believe it was in Hebron a couple of years ago, where Israel investigated, and the ultimate result was I believe, a 2-week suspension and a demotion of the officer involved. That does not provide the redress in that sort of circumstance. At the same time, there have also been investigations that have gone on forever and led nowhere, and this seems to be a common tactic. So I think the whole question of credibility has to be applied not only to the specific allegation, but also to the criminal justice system or the military justice system that exists to investigate and address such allegations. And in this case, I think we see, a very credible allegations, many credible allegations, and a system that is there, if anything, to protect the offenders rather than to truly prosecute and address the violations.
So this leads me to the second question, which you are clearly alluding to in terms of the politicization of the process, that in theory is supposed to work one way, but in practice seems to work quite differently, in large part depending on the country and the politics in the U.S. surrounding that country. And it seems to be on full display in the example you stated where higher level officials, not only are they required to sign on to a document that states Israel in violation of international law or human rights laws, in contrast to other countries, right, where the junior officials' findings is sufficient. But the fact that they have been afraid to do so speaks volumes. So can you explain to us the politics? I mean, you've been inside the kitchen, right, figuratively speaking here. Why would a mid-level or higher level official, if the facts are clear and if they conclude that no, there is credible evidence to show that the relevant law has been violated, why are they afraid to sign it? And is that the case in any other country where they have to sign it? Or why is Israel an exception?
So, first of all, it's, as far as I'm aware, not the case in any other country. And just to give one example, under the Biden administration, which of course was heavily focused on and politically committed to U.S. security assistance to Ukraine, there was, through the Leahy Vetting Forum process and the untraceable assistance process, a unit of concern that was identified, that was communicated to Ukraine that, hey, we're not going to provide, you can't provide assistance to this unit because of our concerns on human rights. And so that was a highly, political challenge, but one in which no one raised any questions that this was the right thing to do. When it comes to Israel, I think more broadly, the challenge that we face both in the State Department and across, I would argue, across our society is, I think, in many ways, even more than it is a policy problem, a political problem. And what I mean by that is that there is a very effective, very well resourced, very smart effort to essentially align America behind a sort of Israel first approach. And there are, as we've seen over time, significant consequences potentially for elected officials and for those who are pursuing a career in which they don't have the protections of the civil service. So I'm here talking about political appointees who rely on parties for their appointments, for their nominations, and on Congress for their confirmations. There are significant consequences that they could pay in terms of if they're an elected official being primaried or losing their seat or losing their funding or losing their support if they're a political appointee or nominee. And for that reason, people tend to steer clear of putting a foot wrong where it might have that sort of implication. And I've had this discussion with people who've been very clear about, that is the consideration they make. And when you ask them to defend it, they will make the point to you. And for example, I'll give this in the context of my Bureau of Political Military Affairs that I used to work in, which works on a daily basis on urgent challenges around the world. So sure, Israel, Palestine, the Middle East, but also Ukraine, also Mexico, Colombia, the Philippines, Taiwan, a whole host of global issues and challenges. And people will say to you, why should I risk my career where I'm having an impact on so many important problems for this one thing, which even if I raise my voice on it, no one's going to do anything about it anyway. So why bother? Why take the risk? I think, first of all, I would say that's more than unfortunate. I think it's a deep mistake because what we have seen in the last couple of years is that the US unconditional military support for Israel essentially has punched a hole in the dike, in the dam of international law itself. And that hole is sort of widening and widening and widening as the water begins to flow more and more through it, to the extent that the entire artifice is now at the risk of collapse. And so I think it has always been a mistake to have an exception for anyone, in this case Israel. But even within that, you also see this materialize in other ways. So, for example, I was working in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs at the State Department in 2022 when Amnesty International published their report assessing that Israel essentially is engaged in the act of apartheid. Apartheid is a crime against humanity under international law. And so I wrote to lawyers in the State Department and said, hey, saw this report from Amnesty International. Can I get your assessment on whether Israel is indeed committing apartheid, is engaged in apartheid? And the response I got was, if we get a direction from a Senate-confirmed individual to conduct that analysis, we will do it, but we're not going to do it for you. And again, it comes back to that cover your ass, if you'll forgive me for saying, sort of mentality when it comes to the political risk associated with criticism of Israel. And that's just to add, I mean, obviously that's not in our own national interest. That's not in the interest of the policy-making system. If there are questions you can't ask, if there are concerns you can't raise because of the political consequences, that leads to political harm and to policy harm. That leads to bad policies. And so it's a real significant problem, I think.
Well, we're certainly seeing the same dynamic in academia, where professors, myself included, and others who work on the Middle East, who are human rights scholars, who are international law scholars, who, if they treat Israel the same way they would treat any other state that's engaging in systematic violations of international law and human rights law and norms, they are attacked, in contrast to if they're doing so with a different country. And, my experience is I have my share of criticism on the record of Egypt, where I've done quite a bit of research about that country, and especially after the Arab Spring. And interestingly, people were quite supportive of criticism of an Arab Muslim state. But if you then apply the same analysis, the same critical analysis, and the same laws to Israel, you're falsely accused of being anti-Semitic or anti-Israel. Just that concept I find to be quite laughable, to be anti a state. But Unfortunately, it has certainly infected the academic sphere as well as what you're explaining in the policy sphere.
Yes, and I think that the academic sphere is a great example of that hole in the dam thing, hole in the dam example, in that, for example, in the last week, there was a professor at UT Austin who posted something online that supported diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, which, of course, are now under fire from the Trump administration. And a donor to the university reached out and is trying to get this professor fired. And I think that just goes to show that, whether or not to paraphrase that famous saying, whether or not you care about Palestine, Palestine cares about you, in the sense that because we have not stood up to protect free speech within our government, within our academia, within our corporations, on our streets, when it comes to this question of the US military support to Israel and the US role in Gaza, that hole is widening to encompass more and more areas. And this is not something that is going to be easy to roll back. But if we are going to, it has to include a rollback of these absurd assaults on criticism of Israel and, calls for supporting the humanity of the Palestinian people. So I think that's a very good example of exactly what we're talking about and why this is a much bigger problem inside the US than just Israel-Palestine, as big a problem as that is.
And I want to go back to the comparative analysis of other countries, especially Egypt, because Egypt is, as you stated, the second largest recipient of foreign military financing. And you were in the political military affairs department for over 11 years in the U.S. State Department. So you've seen quite a bit. You've been able to do some comparative analysis. You spent 3.5 years between Iraq and the West Bank. So can you give us an example of how the same dynamic you're talking about affected Egypt after the Arab Spring, and particularly after 2014, when, a general in the military, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who is now the president of Egypt, was alleged to have orchestrated a coup against a democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi. So I remember that there had been numerous calls to withhold aid, invocation of the Leahy law, and other, human rights related laws as a basis for essentially punishing the Egyptian military. And again, there are similar demands right now vis-a-vis Israel and Israel's military. So explain, how was the State Department's response and what were those types of conversations surrounding Egypt as a way for us to understand this comparison?
Sure. It's a very interesting comparison. And I think it clarifies, first of all, while the exception is by far more pressing and broader when it comes to Israel and human rights, it's certainly by no means the US has not been perfect by any means elsewhere in the world. And so in Egypt, in the context of 2014, there is a provision of the Annual Appropriations Act that says that no security assistance funding may be provided when it is determined that a democratic government has undergone a coup, when it has been overthrown by military means. And of course, that's very much what happened in 2014. Say what you will about the Morsi government, it was democratically elected and it was overthrown by al-Sisi and by the Egyptian military. And the way the Obama administration got around that one was simply to not assess whether or not there had been a coup, right? So the law requires a determination. If the president determines that a coup has occurred, and so rather than saying, no, it wasn't a coup, which would have been absurd on its surface, the lawyers simply never were asked for an opinion on whether or not it was a coup. And so no determination was actually made. That said, at the same time, there were some steps that followed. Some of them were taken by the administration acting with Congress. So up until that point, Israel had been a recipient of what we call cash flow financing. So Egypt, you'll recall we'd said, gets $1.3 billion a year in foreign military financing. Typically with foreign military financing, you have to wait until the money is in the bank to start spending it. So if you want to buy a system that's going to cost you, let's say, $3 billion, you have to wait 3 years until you have enough money in your bank account to start paying for that before you can sign any contracts. But under cash flow financing, which continues to be available, for example, to Israel, there's essentially, as we know that Congress is going to appropriate these funds anyway, once you have your $1.3 billion, you can start with your contract, you can start with your payment, because we know that the money is coming in the out years. And so after the coup, First of all, the US suspended or ended the cash flow financing mechanism for Egypt. We can have a long discussion about that because it turned out that once a country has been involved in cash flow financing for many years and has a whole list of programs that are being funded that way, it's actually the US government that ends up holding the bag with the defense industry for all the unfulfilled contracts. And so that turned out to be much more difficult, I think, than people had anticipated. But another thing that has happened in the years since is that Congress itself has stepped in, and in the Annual Appropriations Act since 2014, 2015, has included provisions that limit the amount of money Egypt can get within that $1.3 billion, pending certifications by the president on their progress on certain human rights issues. Some of that money is what we call unwaverable. There has to be progress, for example, on the release of political prisoners, or they lose a certain amount. And some of that money, which is tied to broader human rights reforms, can be withheld, but also, the president or the secretary of state can issue a national security waiver to say, I agree that progress hasn't been sufficient, but it's really important to the national security of the United States that this go forward. I think we can have a debate about, again, how those determinations on national security are made, what national security means in this context, what it looks like in the relationship with Egypt. But in any event, at least in that context, we have seen a conditioning of assistance or a partial conditioning of assistance. Whereas again, in the Israel context, if you were to propose a conditioning of assistance in the appropriations process in Congress, you would be probably laughed out of the room.
Yeah, and I think that's really helpful because there are people who are certainly critical of America, the U.S. government's hypocrisy on other regimes that are authoritarian or that are engaging in systematic human rights violations. And so it is one of degree, but I think as you've explained, it's one of significant difference in degree and substance, especially when you're talking about requiring the approval of higher level officials just to make the conclusion that is supported by the facts. So I want to kind of close out our conversation by focusing on the last awful, horrendous 19 months. So October 7, 2023, Hamas attacks Israel, engages in human rights violations and war crimes, and from their perspective, of course, they think it's an act of resistance, and that's a debate that continues, but my position is that certainly war crimes have been committed and civilians were unlawfully targeted in Hamas's militant attack. And however, notwithstanding that tragedy of loss of life of Israelis and the hostages that have been taken, we now have at least 65,000 Palestinians that have been killed by the Israeli military, and the estimates are higher. That's just what we can prove for now. We have over 125,000 Palestinians injured. The entire medical infrastructure is collapsing, with more than 60% of the hospitals completely destroyed by Israel, doctors being assassinated, journalists being assassinated. And the last 11 weeks, during June 2025, Israel has intentionally barred entrance of all food into Gaza in a stated policy of mass starvation. So there is no dearth of evidence that war crimes have been committed, or crimes against humanity have been committed. And again, what many international legal scholars now say is outright genocide. Can you explain to us the role of the State Department, the role of, particularly U.S. export arms, because there are numerous Americans who have really focused their advocacy on kind of a do no harm approach. It may be Israel that's committing the genocide, but at the very least, as Americans, we should not be funding that state in its committal of genocide. And that specifically would require a ceasing of all military aid for all the reasons that we've just discussed in our conversation. And yet, they've actually received $20 billion when they normally receive $3.3 billion. Explain to our audience this paradox that has such perverse and horrific consequences on Palestinian lives.
I think you can't explain it in a moral sense. You can't explain it in a policy context. You can only explain it in a political context. And that's because, again, it is Congress that is appropriating this money. It is our elected representatives who are saying essentially that we would rather add to the national debt and have our children and grandchildren paying off these costs for generations to come than cut our military funding for a government engaged in these war crimes and these crimes against humanity. And then it is executive branches, successive executives, Biden and now Trump, who are essentially refusing to apply the law, whether that takes the form of simply turning a blind eye or specifically overcoming some of the requirements in law when it comes to the provision of arms to a country engaged in gross violations of human rights, or when it comes to a willingness even to sidestep the congressional notification processes that are laid out in law, in some cases, in order to accelerate the delivery of the weapons that are responsible for so much harm. And let's not make any bones about it, these weapons are responsible for so much harm. Not only, of course, are all of the fighter jets that Israel flies that are dropping these bombs made in America, but so are the vast majority of the munitions themselves, so are the vast majority of the bullets and ammunition down to the ground level, so are the sniper rifles, so are the radios and the logistics processes and all of this, and the training as well. So much of this comes down to the United States and to our role in this, without which Israel would not be able to conduct itself in the way that it has and that it continues to in Gaza. It would have had to, many months ago, had we pulled the plug even on, specific parts and components for those fighter jets, for example, would have had to make some significant reconsiderations about where its defense priorities actually lie. Instead, it has been able to continue to pursue this horrific operation while at the same time striking out, and to note, against the civilian targets in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Syria, and so forth. So I think that it is impossible to recognize that this is not an act of omission, this is an act of commission by the United States, both through the appropriation of funding and the continuing flow against all of our laws when it comes to the arms.
Yeah, I think the other obvious paradox, or I should say contradiction, is that I always pose the counterfactual, which is, what if an Arab state were doing exactly what Israel is doing to 2.3 million Jews that were trapped in a 21 mile by 7 mile strip of land that cannot even escape? That Arab country was assassinating the Jewish journalists in Gaza because there are no other journalists permitted from abroad to be able to at least document the facts of what's happening. And so that if Israel claims that in fact it is not violating war crimes, right, they could have journalists there to show that it's not. And what would the world do? What would the U.S. State Department do? What would the U.S. Congress do?
Right. I mean, I think in that context, we'd be well past the point of restricting arms transfers. I think we'd be, in the middle of, if not already concluded with, a no-fly zone and, operations to defend innocent population, as indeed we have been and we saw in the context of the Bosnian Civil War and Kosovo and all of that. And for that matter, even in Libya, where the US interceded to prevent Gaddafi's approach, to a large civilian population center. Here, on the other hand, unlike those contexts, unlike the context of Ukraine, which is another place that is facing a brutal and unprovoked invasion and occupation, in this context in Israel, rather than pushing it back, we are providing the arms.
Well, thank you so much, Josh Paul, for sharing your expertise and enlightening our audience about these complicated and complex laws and policies and practices. And I hope that this certainly causes our listeners to think more deeply about these issues and to do more research. And also, I understand that you are now part of a new policy, the nonprofit organization that focuses on changing foreign policy on these issues and others. And so I hope that our listeners will also read more about the work you've been doing with a new policy. And I'll give you just an opportunity to make any closing remarks before we conclude our conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Sahar. And thanks to all of your listeners who've stuck through this whole conversation. I think I'll just end on that note, which is again to say that this is a problem that we can try to attack through law, through litigation, whether within the US or under international law, including through the agencies of international law and justice, but also through third-party courts. But at the end of the day, it is a political problem for us here in the United States. And until we really get at that issue, at the politics around this, we are going to be fighting these battles unsuccessfully. What we need to do is shift the politics. That's, what my organization, A New Policy, is here to do. We're not just here to shift the policy. We're here to create the space for the policy to shift through addressing the politics. But it's also, I think, very much relevant to what CSRR does at Rutgers on a daily basis by thinking about the intersection between violations of the law, violations of human rights, and the underlying causes and the politics behind those that drive them forward, and how we can address those so that we can all live in a world here at home and around the globe that is safer and better for everyone.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.